All right, so we will get started. And I just want to say thanks to all of you for joining us today for this conversation on the missing middle. And I'll start with a brief screen share to introduce some of the folks. So Sierra Club presentation, we're going to talk about the missing middle today. Um, I want to quickly give a recognition to our Sierra Club team, Montgomery County Group. My name is Shruti Bhatnagar. I'm the chair of the Montgomery County Group. We have Brian Ditzler, delegate to the Maryland chapter, who's an ex-com member. Dave Sears, land use committee chair. Tina Slater, transportation committee chair. Amy Maron, zero waste lead. Clint Sobrati, who's an ex-com member on the transportation committee. Jennifer Rossmere, treasurer, Susan Erlinger, secretary, Sylvia Tonietti, who's our water lead, Bill Kirwan, who's land use committee, and is going to be helping me today with this discussion. I think we have a lot of other people I see, and I just want to thank many of our volunteers who continue to help us do the work that we do. And without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker and council member, Hans Riemer. I don't think he really needs an introduction, but still he was first elected to county council in 2010, represents 1 million Montgomery County residents as an at-large member. A couple of quick things about Hans. He has dedicated his public service career to creating opportunity for all people to achieve their potential. As a council member, he works towards this vision by advocating to fund public education and public transportation, early childhood programs, libraries, recreation, human services, housing, and economic development. And he is the chair of the FED committee right now. Hans is a dedicated environmentalist and works to strengthen Montgomery County's superb rural, suburban, and urban areas by placing walkability, public transportation, and sustainability at center of our planning goals. Hans and his wife Angela have 2 young boys, and they live in Tacoma Park, Montgomery County. So with that, I would like to welcome Councilmember Hans Riemer and to share some remarks with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you so much. I am really glad to be here. I see many friends and familiar faces and a few new faces. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion. I thank you for the invitation, and I'm excited about all of the momentum that is being generated on this issue. As Shruti mentioned, I chair the planning committee. I think most of you are well aware of that, but that is where we handle zoning changes and master plans, and that's where we try to drive the housing agenda. And over the last month, I have been working really hard with my colleagues to put forward a number of very significant housing proposals. The first one is a construction fund for our Housing Opportunities Commission so that they can have access to ready capital to build new buildings that have a high level of affordability in them. And so rather than going to the banks, they would have a $50 or $100 million fund to draw from, and they would repay and draw from and repay. And we've estimated that we'll be able to produce thousands of units of housing through that program and spend somewhere between $500 and $600 million on construction over the next 10 years. So we're really excited about that program with our affordable housing partner. Then we just introduced a legislation that I've been working on for some time to provide a significant incentive for high-rise construction right on top of Metro. And I know that if there's one thing I think most people in the county can agree upon, it is that we want high-rise on top of Metro, but we're not getting it because the market isn't providing for it. There's some significant issues with the economics of high-rise as well as the economics of building on top of Metro. So this proposal, according to Metro, if every station was built out to capacity, would be able to support up to 8,600 housing units. And of course, a sizable share of those would be affordable thanks to our NPDU ordinance. And then this past week, we talked about a fund for the preservation of affordable housing in the Purple Line corridor. And we're going to be advancing a strategy to add $50 million to our housing fund in bond finance so that nonprofits can come into the county and find gap financing to acquire existing buildings, market affordable buildings, and then own them. And then that provides long-term security of affordability in the corridor, and also a pipeline for the long-term redevelopment of housing in the corridor in a way that is, very sensitive to existing communities. So that is 3 very significant housing proposals that added together will make a very significant contribution to meeting our regional housing goals. But there are still some pieces that are missing. And one of them is the missing middle strategy. And so what I wanted to just share about missing middle, we took on a big battle about missing middle housing already. We worked together on a very meaningful housing proposal last year, the accessory dwelling unit proposal. And accessory dwelling units are missing middle housing. Missing middle is not really a new concept. If you look at most modern communities planned in the county, for example, right now we at the County Council, we are finishing up the Germantown town sector zone. If you look around Germantown or Montgomery Village or Gaithersburg or Clarksburg, you actually see quite a lot of missing middle housing. You see smaller townhouses, you see apartment buildings, you see all kinds of different housing types blended into a single neighborhood. The difference is that older communities and then certain communities in the county that really didn't necessarily support that type of diversity of housing, they do not have that. So it's a concept that we have been intentional about supporting for decades. And when you see a new community, it generally includes a lot of missing middle housing. But communities that didn't have that same long-term forethought and planning strategy, Silver Spring downtown or Tacoma Park or Chevy Chase or Bethesda, a lot of your inner ring really was not, the zoning didn't allow for that. It was part of a movement to really exclude that or to close that off as an opportunity. It's either single family. If I could ask everyone to mute your phone, your screen, if you don't mind. Shruti will handle questions, I'm sure. It's either apartment buildings or single family or single unit property. And so that is where really the concept of the missing middle comes. And if you walk around downtown Silver Spring, you'll see it. It's very vivid. You've either got single unit housing, which is quite expensive, or you've got larger apartment buildings. And what we should really have, I believe, I think many of you believe, is that every neighborhood should have a diversity of housing types. You should have larger houses and smaller houses. You should have apartment buildings and duplexes. You should have various choices. And when you have various choices of housing that at various points of affordability, then you are supporting a community that is inclusive and has an open door to various different kinds of people. And we're certainly concerned about the ability of young people to have access to our inner ring neighborhoods. I think anyone can drive till they qualify, but Silver Spring, for example, since we're really focused there, has always been a place where younger families have been able to get a start. And that door is really closing. You see it closing faster in Tacoma Park. You have to be quite wealthy to get a single family home in East Bethesda or Bethesda. And Silver Spring is changing. Silver Spring, what makes Silver Spring so amazing is the diversity. That's what everybody loves, I think, who lives there, is the fact that you go to Ellsworth on any night, you can see people from every walk of life. And, every neighborhood just has such a complexity, so many different, interesting, wonderful people. And the problem is that our success is going to create a long-term challenge as proximity to jobs, proximity to quality of life drives the market. Over time, over the next 10, 20 years, I believe you're going to see Silver Spring become a place where either you have a lot of money for one of the single family unit properties, or you live in an apartment, but there's not much in between. And so that is one reason why I'm really excited about, in the Silver Spring Master Plan, kind of piloting this concept of rezoning existing neighborhoods and allowing for different housing types, whether it's duplexes or triplexes, however it gets configured, allowing that to happen. I don't think it's going to happen a ton, but where I live, right up on Piney Branch Road, you can see right by Tacoma Middle, there's 2 enormous single-family houses that are just going up, looming over Piney Branch Road. It was a pretty sizable lot that was sold, and we have 2 houses. I'm sure they're going to be selling for well over $1 million each. That would have been a perfect place for, 2 four-plexes, or, some kind of, small apartment complex. It would have been just fine. It's right on the bus line. It's a 5-minute trip to Silver Spring, or 5-minute trip to the Metro, 5-minute trip to Tacoma Park. But that's illegal. You can't do that. You can't build that type of housing. So I'm very eager to see. I think if there's a community that can pull together and figure out how to embrace this very difficult evolution of zoning, I think it's Silver Spring. I think it really is consistent with the history of the community, the values and the politics of the community, to be willing to kind of be creative and help all of government kind of evolve, and all of zoning and all of land use kind of evolve. So we'll see where this goes. I want to thank Partop. He has done a fantastic job on the planning board in many ways, but he also made sure that this concept of the missing middle was something that the planning board would consider. And so we're off to the races. Thank you, Partop. And let's all work together and do our best to kind of, I think we can have a real community engagement and a community win, and a lot of positive feelings about it if we can all figure out how to talk about it, how to explain it, and then ultimately how to make it happen.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Riemer, for joining us and sharing comments. Please stay with us if you can. But what I would like to do is I would like to go ahead and have Bill Kirwan, who's my colleague at Sierra Club, introduce himself and share a brief PowerPoint presentation on the missing middle housing, after which I will introduce the panelists and we will have a conversation on missing middle. So Bill, it's all yours.
All righty, thank you, Shruti. And good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Kirwan, and I'm an architect and resident of Sligo Park Hills. I also sit on the Sierra Club Montgomery County's Land Use and Transportation Committee. Let me just get this thing up in front of everybody's screen. Hopefully everybody can see it. This PowerPoint slideshow I'm about to share with you came from an idea that I had back in February of hosting a bicycle tour this spring of the existing stock of missing middle housing that I knew already existed in Silver Spring, but most notably for me around my daughter's elementary school, the East Silver Spring Elementary. We on the Land Use and Transportation Committee thought it would be a good educational tool to illustrate that this is nothing new in our neighborhoods, how the concept of multiple scales to affordability of housing across the US has been in our neighborhood since the early part of the 20th century. And in the case of downtown Silver Spring, unbeknownst to many of us. And lastly, how this existing stock of missing middle housing could offer helpful clues to how it might be done successfully if allowed in the future. Now, of course, with the pandemic, that delayed our plans to organize a real bicycle tour. So I thought, why not create a virtual one? I've been going on 3.5-mile walks with my wife every morning since the stay-at-home order went into effect. And back in May, we adjusted our route to include Tacoma Park. I began noticing missing middle housing in much greater numbers than I ever knew existed. I recorded locations from our walks and then took the actual bike ride myself. But I'm about to invite you to join me on virtually. In and around downtown Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, Maryland, and Tacoma Park, DC. So here we go. So what is missing middle housing? Opticos Design defines it this way: residential building types such as duplexes, fourplexes, and bungalow courts that provide diverse housing options to support walkable communities, locally serving retail, and public transportation options. We call them missing because they have typically been illegal to build since the mid-1940s, and middle because they sit in the middle of a spectrum between detached single-family homes and mid-rise to high-rise apartment buildings in terms of form and scale, as well as number of units and often affordability. In under an hour's bike ride, one can find 20 or more examples of missing middle housing in East Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, and across the state line in adjacent portions of Tacoma Park, DC, that were all built in the early 20th century and predated current restrictive single-family zoning. The following virtual bike tour begins in East Silver Spring and concludes in Tacoma Park, DC, and illustrates the diversity of housing types that existed in our neighborhoods prior to current single-family zoning restrictions. The only rule for the tour you're about to see was that the missing middle housing examples had to be found on streets that were in neighborhoods dominated by single-family residential zoning. So put on your helmets and let's go. The tour starts in East Silver Spring near ESS Elementary School. Schreider Street Court is a small little cul-de-sac that's directly adjacent to the east side of East Silver Spring Elementary. And here we find multi-unit small apartment buildings or fourplexes, very much residentially scaled and in some cases look like a house by themselves. Right across the street from ESS on Silver Spring Avenue are duplexes or fourplexes. Again, very much residentially scaled. Now, as we head in closer to downtown Silver Spring, just off Fenton Street along Bonifant, the first house as you enter the residential neighborhood, we find a duplex. You can see the original main block of the house to the left, and an addition that was built to the rear that has its own separate entrance via that pressure-treated wood stair. Jumping back towards East Silver Spring again, there's a small little cul-de-sac called Twin Holly Lane, just off of Sligo Avenue. And here we find a townhouse court. As we go across Sligo Avenue, along Ritchie Avenue, we find a duplex. It almost looks like an old farmhouse that probably was here back in the 1920s or 30s. But you can see the two front doors showing each individual entrance. Now we move on to Tacoma Park. Just off Tacoma Avenue, along Baltimore Avenue, we find this duplex in the historic district of Tacoma Park, each with its own side-loaded front door and sharing a front porch. As we head in deeper into Tacoma Park, off of Maple Avenue, just north of Carroll, we find these examples of duplexes. And directly neighboring that is another duplex along Maple Avenue. As we head up Maple Avenue, up at the corner of Maple and Tulip, we find a beautiful example of a duplex. I, for years, thought this was a single-family residence until I looked closer and saw the two front doors and the two addresses. As we head down Tulip at the corner of Tulip and Spruce, we find another historic house that has been modified into a triplex. You see on the slide image on the right, you see the front of the house with its front door and original front porch. And then the side entrance has been converted into an entrance to one of the units. And then around the side on Spruce Street, we find an entrance to the basement unit. As we head up Carroll Avenue to the east and peel off onto Columbia Avenue, we find another example of a duplex. A large home with a basement unit to the lower right. Continuing up Carroll, we find several examples here that I never knew were multi-unit duplexes and fourplexes before. This first example on Carroll is a fourplex. It's an old bungalow with its carport to the left and the original front porch straight ahead. And what gives it away are the 4 mailboxes at the front stoop. A few doors up, we find a 5-plex. This was the one and only 5-plex I found on my journey. Now this 1.5-story bungalow was probably added onto the rear and then subdivided into 5 units. Continue further up Carroll, we find this example of a duplex, somewhat similar to the one we saw on Baltimore Avenue, but in this case having a 2-story front porch. Further up Carroll, at Carroll and Lincoln, we find another example of a duplex, with its front door off of Carroll and its secondary door off of Lincoln Avenue. As we go back deeper behind this house, around Manor Circle, we find another example of a duplex, or possibly a 4-plex. Then as we jump across Sligo Creek Park and off of Flower Avenue on Houston Street, we find this example of a triplex. And again, you have to look closely to find these because you'll notice again the 3 mailboxes at the bottom of the front steps. As we jump back to Tacoma Park heading toward the DC line, we find this example off of Cedar Avenue. Another duplex, probably a cousin to the ones we saw on Maple Avenue. And we finish our tour across the state line in Tacoma Park, DC. Just below Cedar Street, heading south on 4th Street, we find this more modern example of a courtyard apartment. This was probably built about 10 years ago. Then around the corner on Cedar Street, we find this example of a more historic courtyard apartment, right adjacent to single-family homes. Then as we hop across Piney Ranch Drive and take a turn on Butternut Street, a couple blocks east of Georgia Avenue, we find this wonderful example of a courtyard apartment. And then right next door to it, on Butternut Street, another duplex. So if missing middle housing was permitted in single-family residential zones in Montgomery County, it could also look like these examples from across the United States. The upper right corner being more of an ADU with a unit over the garage. The top right corner being a quad. The bottom left being a multi-unit building, very much in the prairie style, looking very much like a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And then to the right, a duplex. As we'll hear from Liz Brent later this evening, single-family home values are skyrocketing in Montgomery County, and particularly around downtown Silver Spring. More missing middle housing could help with affordability in the following ways. A duplex on average is about 60% of the cost of a new single-family home. A triplex can be 42% of the cost of a new single-family home. And a 4-plex can be 32% of the cost of a new single-family home. So creating more options means creating affordability and social equity. As is evident from this virtual bike tour around downtown Silver Spring, missing middle housing has been in our neighborhoods all along. Most of us probably didn't realize this, nor had any concerns about it before. It can fit into existing neighborhoods comfortably, does not erode property values, as is evident in Tacoma Park, and creates affordable housing for people who may not be able to afford a single-family home in our county, but may wish to plant roots and eventually buy a single-family home here. So what is there to be afraid of?
Bill, thank you for that presentation. I hope that was informative for everyone. I am going to introduce the panelists and then we will take it from there. So with Pratap Verma. Pratap is a Washington, D.C. native who works at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as an associate counsel focusing on FOIA litigation, electronic transformation, and privacy law and compliance. Pratap received his JD with honor from the Pennsylvania State University School of Law in 2005, along with certificates in transnational law from Duke University Comparative Law, certificates from the University of London, and received his BA from the University of Maryland, College Park in 2001. Also one of the founding members of a grassroots advocacy group, the Friends of Forest Glen, and blog Finding Forest Glen. Additionally, Pratap represents Forest Glen at County Citizens Advisory Board and currently is a commissioner on the Montgomery County Planning Board. Welcome to the forum, Pratap. Liz Brent is the founder and principal broker of Go Brent Real Estate, a residential brokerage specializing in Silver Spring and the Route 1 corridor. She has lived and worked in Silver Spring for over 25 years and has raised her 3 children here. In 2017, she founded Silver Spring Cares, a nonprofit organization with the goal of connecting the needs of local nonprofits and the resources of Silver Spring residents. She has been actively involved in the community's housing discussions for decades and has a deep understanding and wealth of knowledge about the history and the issues we are exploring. Welcome, Liz. We also have a young activist with us. Zoe Tishev is a recent graduate of Clark's High School and a rising freshman at Duke University. A Germantown native, Zoe is on the board action committee for Trans steering committee of Montgomery for All. More recently, she spearheaded the effort to extend free ridership to students on Metrobus and ride-on routes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So with that, I welcome all our panelists today. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion. And I'm going to open this conversation with our planning board member, Pratap Verma. Pratap, would you like to share some insights into as you?
Thank you, Shruti, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you, Sierra Club, for hosting a very important session. And thank you, Bill Kerwin, for an incredible presentation that clearly took a lot of time and I think was insightful in so many different ways. You know, as a product of immigrants who came from India and moved to the DC area, I was fortunate enough to grow up in missing middle housing. This particular topic is very close to my heart. It's the reason why my parents were able to achieve the American dream. And through the support of Councilmember Hans Riemer, you know, who has led the charge on this kind of advocacy and leadership in this arena, I'm proud to know that we have a group of local leaders and grassroots efforts to really make a difference in a place that is so diverse, like Silver Spring. You know, Silver Spring is routinely amongst the top 5 most diverse cities in America. Not many people know this. It's always Houston, Texas, Jersey City, and then you have Silver Spring, Rockville, Germantown, Gaithersburg. And we are so fortunate enough to live in such a vibrant community. And I grew up in missing middle housing right here in Silver Spring, right at the border of Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, off of Tulana Drive. And, you know, I saw firsthand how my parents were able to, you know, not only have a certain level of assurance that they could have affordability, but they were also able to put us through college, you know, move up to the next level of housing that they wanted to achieve. And that dream is slowly slipping away for a lot of people. You know, I'm Generation X, and then there's millennials, and then there's Generation Z. Well, when we look at the housing data, we know that sort of different groups, you know, starting with the boomers, were able to buy housing at a certain level. And as you go further down the line, net worth is established by how much real estate you have. Well, a lot of the younger generations do not have the capability, the capacity to actually purchase affordable housing. And so what our approach is to not only increase the supply of different housing types, as Councilmember Riemer had mentioned, a lot of the work on the accessory dwelling units allows for another option of a certain kind of housing. So as we had this discussion today, be mindful that missing middle housing is just another tool. It's another tool in our toolkit that allows us to address affordability. It allows us to address climate change. We know also that 72% of new housing needs to be near transit. And so missing middle typically is going to work in more of an urban format where there's going to be a demand for such housing. So just because an area may be designated in a missing middle kind of zoning doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to turn into some of the examples that Bill was showing. But what we would like to do is give people options, because right now the only option we have is when a house is torn down, you get new construction, and new construction in desirable areas like zip codes 20910 are going upwards to 1.1 to 1.4 million, sometimes maybe even higher. You know, I'm currently building a house in Silver Spring and Forest Glen, and I'm trying to walk the walk. It's going to have an ADU. It's an intergenerational suite. It's going to have enough space for my 3 children, my husband, and also our nanny. And the idea is, how can we have a home that can handle up to 12 people, a few blocks from the metro? Well, I'm doing that, but a lot of times when people are building homes, they're often building it just for a smaller family. But what if you allowed the zoning to be a little bit more creative and create options? That's the goal here. So I'm really proud of the people that are in this room and the community that are so passionate about these issues. I take this kind of issues very seriously, especially in this day and age where equity, social justice, racial equity is at the forefront of our national conversation, where we're seeing this larger bubbling of anger because the gap between the haves and the have-nots have dramatically increased in the last decades. And as the official racial and social justice liaison for the Park and Planning Commission, I want to tell you that I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that all people are represented, particularly those of our most vulnerable communities. So thank you, Shruti. Thank you, the entire Sierra Club team. And I look forward to a very productive conversation.
Thank you so much, Pratap. And then we will move on to Liz Brent. Liz, as a realtor, what's your perspective on the missing middle, and what do you see in the county?
Good evening, Shruti. Hello, everybody. So my experience, I mean, I've lived in this area. I've lived in Silver Spring for 25 years. My experience is mostly south, Silver Spring, Bethesda, Kensington. And what we're seeing in prices within a mile of metro station is that they are rising much more rapidly than areas outside of metro stations. To give you an example, in the year 2000, in kind of far Potomac, at the corner of Travilla and Glen, the average was $85,000. In 2020, it was $1,183,000, but that's only a 38% increase. In a mile from the Silver Spring Metro, we have an increase from $275,000 in the year 2000 to an average sales price of $713,000 in 2020. Now, these are fee simple prices, so it does not include condos. So we're seeing a real increase in a real problem. There's just simply not enough housing. And because there's not enough housing, if, for example, you live close in Silver Spring and you want a larger house or you want a different floor plan, unless you can purchase without selling the house that you're in, you're much more likely to stay and renovate and add on, which is fine, except you remove that small house from the small house market. And it's just a vicious circle because nobody wants to leave. So that's what we put 3 houses on the market 2 weeks ago in various places. One was in 20901, one was in 20910, and I don't remember where the other one was, but all Silver Spring. Between the 3 houses, we had over 150 agent showings. 150 agents made a specific appointment to show the house. Because of COVID-19, we are not allowing overlapping showings, which means in some of these houses, you didn't have more than 15 minutes to be in it. We had over 30 offers on these 3 houses. So we have a very, very severe problem.
Thank you so much, Liz. And with that, we want to move to the next panelist, Zoe. Zoe is from Up County. Zoe, would you like to share your perspective on the missing middle and what do you see in Up County?
Yeah, sure. So I am a rising college student at Duke University. And as I'm sure many of you know, the college debt crisis is kind of staggering right now. So being an upcoming rising student in college, it's kind of frightening to look at my financial prospects. And I want to come back to Montgomery County when I'm done with school, and I want to live here because this is the place that I call home. But I'm getting increasingly concerned that I'm not going to be able to afford a place in Montgomery County because of the insane debt that I would be assuming as a college student. And kind of like basically highlighting what Pratap already pointed out, that, you know, further generations, younger people are having our options shrink because of financial constraints. So what I want to see in Up County and in Montgomery County in general is definitely the development of more housing types of all types, affordable for sure, especially in the Up County. I don't have a car, and housing options up here are very sparse for people who don't want to live an auto-centric lifestyle. Our only real transit accessible location is by Century Boulevard, and even then, everything there is apartments. Nothing for homeowners, nothing optional for people who might want a bigger space to raise a family. So that's what I'm seeing in Up County. I'm hoping that with the whole Thrive 2050 plan and the bigger focus on affordable and diverse housing types and moving away from car-centric development, I hope that we can start seeing that in the car-centric sprawling places like Up County.
Great, thank you, Zoe. And with that, I'm going to have Bill ask his first question today. And if guests have questions, please feel free to enter it in the chat and I will read them out to be effective with a lot of chat coming in. So just it's easier to moderate. Thank you.
All right. Question really any of the panelists can handle, but Pratap, you probably are the closest to this issue. Liz, you might be as well. What parallels do you see between the ADU discussion we had this past year and the conversation we're starting with missing middle housing, both in regard to challenges in that discussion as well as opportunities that may be different?
I can go first if that's okay. So, you know, the ADU conversation was great because it really did allow, as a type of missing middle, it did allow a certain level of utility with existing homes, particularly when people are looking to have, in many cases, family members who could either age in place, or in many cases for people who are recent graduates who could not afford to rent housing near transit or other areas, and now have an option to coexist with existing homes, existing, in some cases, maybe even their own family. And it was a rather allow people to have kind of a more dynamic residential opportunity. And the previous ADU regulations basically made it so you couldn't have an ADU. I mean, by the time you ran through the parameters, you know, the certain distance amongst other ADUs and all the other requirements, even new construction homes, the house had to be at least 4 years old, which never made any sense. And so by allowing an ADU to really be an effective tool for increasing our housing output, we actually were able to increase the rental market, because these are rentals primarily, right? And with what we're trying to do now with studying missing middle opportunities in Silver Spring, and Liz can talk more about this, the opportunities for duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. Bill, I don't know if there's a name for units that have 5 units, pentaflexes, I don't know. But those can be either rental or they could actually be purchase. They could actually be units that you could purchase. So you could have a house, and you see this happening by now on the Tacoma side of DC. I forget the name of the development. I want to say it's called Tacoma Flats.
Yes.
It's a beautiful, from the exterior, it's this beautiful kind of stately home that I believe has like 5 units. And I'd like to get a tour of it, but we were planning to, but then COVID-19 happened. But each one of those units can be sold. So for individuals who want to have home ownership, this kind of missing middle housing option that we're exploring does allow both the rental component and purchase component. And once again, going back to Zoe's point that, you know, so much of a younger generation's home purchase is so difficult, is a very, it can be so expensive. Well, giving people opportunities to purchase homes, and if you want to just rent, is what we're trying to do here.
Thank you, Pratap. Bill, I think there's a question for you from Debbie.
Yes, just going through the chats, I see a question from Debbie Cohen, and Liz, this might be a good one for you. Typically, how are yards maintained, and are the units held in fee or rented, or 1 unit in fee and other units rented by the fee owner? Are the missing middle housing types usually developed by developers, existing owners, rezoned after estate sales, or other options?
Yeah, ownership, it can be held in different ways. What we see mostly in Tacoma Park is there is an investor that owns the entire building, and each of the units is rented out. I'm not saying all of them are that way, but we don't see a lot of condo purchases in Tacoma Park of those older homes. So fee simple means that, for instance, if it's a duplex, 2 houses that are attached, but there's a line that shared wall is actually 2 pieces of property. I think it's unlikely that we're going to, that's the simplest way to hold title. I think it's unlikely that we're going to see a lot of that, unfortunately, unless the county is able to do something about the tremendous expense to subdivide. But what I hope we will see a lot of is smaller apartment buildings, triplexes that are built as condos. And in fact, we're seeing a lot of that in houses that already exist, like large row houses in Petworth in DC, where they're turning a lot of those into 3-level condos. And in that case, you have a condo fee and the land is shared ownership. Did I cover everything, Debbie?
I think you did, Liz.
I think there was a question about the yard, like who takes care of things. In a condo situation, ownership situation, where each person owns the physical space. Let's say there's a triplex. Someone owns the 1st floor, a second person owns the 2nd floor, a 3rd person owns the 3rd floor. They also pay a fee monthly that would take care of, say, shoveling the walk in the winter, or whatever, you know, cutting the lawn, whatever needs to be done. Or you could have an investor hold the deed to the property and rent out separate units. So there's a variety of ways that this can be done. And let me just mention also to Parthop's comment, there's really no perfect solution to our problem. We have to attack it from a lot of different directions. So as people say, well, if we're not going to build that many ADUs, why do this at all? Or if we're not going to tear down that many houses, why do this at all? We have to do everything that can possibly help our critical, dire housing situation.
That's such an important point, because I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach. I think, you know, the obvious thing is to assume that there's one solution that'll fix it all, but there isn't. It's going to take lots of different housing types to solve the housing crisis in Montgomery County. One just comment that Ayal Lee made is that it pointed out that the Maple Avenue duplexes that I showed are actually quads. So that's actually good news. Terrific.
One of the questions is, instead of building so many high-rise apartments, why not build missing middle downtown, and why not rehab underused office and retail in downtown Silver Spring into missing middle? This is from Joyce. Is that something, Councilmember Riemer, you would like to answer?
I could try. I mean, I think we need to allow for a lot more different types of housing, and certainly in the urban core, we want tall buildings. I mean, you know, we want as many people to live there as you know, really as possible, and that creates for a really strong economy there, and that supports our quality of life. You know, great retail and restaurants, and everybody able to live near transit, you know, to metro. You know, I think what we're really talking about now is that kind of outer, you know, the next ring out from the downtown, and whether to allow a homeowner to convert a house, you know, to a 3-apartment unit house, or, you know, someone to build on an empty lot, you know, to build a duplex or a four-plex or something like that. If someone was able to get a larger piece of property, you know, they can even now apply for more dense housing, but it doesn't happen very often. Usually, you know, it's very limited that you'll get a new small apartment building. There is one in downtown Tacoma Park. It's really Tacoma, DC, though, kind of right across from Busboys and Poets, as a single-family house that was just converted into, I think, a 8-unit condo complex for sale.
I think that's one. Parthop just mentioned that.
Okay, it's called like what's it called, Pratap? The
Tacoma Flats?
Tacoma Flats.
Okay, I was thinking of a different one.
Okay.
The name of a person's name. In any event, you can walk over and see it. But you know, that was once, not long ago, a single unit, and now it has 8, and it looks quite pleasant from the street, you know, and it's a very, I think, appropriate building type for that area. So I think we just want to be able to allow more different mixes of building types, you know, and that will help Silver Spring continue to be the kind of community that we love. But you know, I think the thing that we all have to grapple with is, what's the long-term future of Silver Spring? You know, what does the next 10 to 20 years hold? And, you know, I think it is gentrifying. You know, I think that the single family properties are going to become prohibitively expensive. And you're already seeing that with the teardowns. And so, you know, what do we want to do about that? That trend is just going to continue. And what we're talking about now is a way that you can continue to have homes that are kind of starter price, even if they're not the same size that, you know, the starter home maybe that Bill and I, you know, bought, they're going to be a little smaller because land is more scarce, you know, it's more expensive. But you could have a unit in a duplex or a fourplex. You could rent, or you could own, you know, a courtyard cottage complex. You could still have a shot at kind of that, more entry level price point before it's gone.
Hans, if I could, Shruti, is it okay if I jump in here?
Sure.
So I just want to pick up on something that Hans said, and also to the questioner, I believe it was Joyce. I think kind of the reverse of that is, why does it have to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, why does it have to be in Silver Spring? Why can't it be downtown, the true commercial area? And I mean, what I am seeing, and I've actually said this for years, is that I think that the neighborhood that is going to change the most in all of Montgomery County over the next 10 years is East Silver Spring, because it has this amazing combination of walkability and older homes and larger lot sizes. And we don't really have a choice between, do we put, we don't have a choice about whether or not a lot of these homes are going to come down or be substantially expanded. The market will make that choice. What we have a choice of, if we allow the missing middle, if we support the missing middle, is that the developer, instead of, I mean, look, if they're building, there's now a under contract, Hans, I think you mentioned this, on Ritchie Avenue at 1.3. That's on the corner of Ritchie and Piney Branch. So if you put a new home in the center of East Silver Spring on Thayer or Easley, the one I handled at the bottom of Easley, across the street went from apartment buildings, and next to a very small house went for a 1,337, I think. So we are going to see new homes, very large new homes at 1.5 and 1.6. And we can't stop that. And I'm a believer that people have the right to do whatever they wish to if it's legal on their land. So my wish is that we allow the developer to have the choice between, do I want to put up one very large house, or do I want to put up a triplex, say? So the massing is going to come. It's already come. There's no question about that. It's, do we want to give the developer or homeowner, whoever is doing it, an opportunity to build something other than one very large house? And the developers that are working in these, in this type of, I mean, we haven't seen that many yet, but the developer that did both of the houses on Thayer, both of the houses on Ritchie, I mean, he's probably done, he did the top off on Bonifant. I mean, he's probably done 8, maybe more, is a young, now I sound like my grandmother, a young African-American man who grew up in this area and also has a solar business on the side. These are not big pocketed developers. They're just not, there's not enough money in the one lot, house is tiny and is going to be torn down. There just isn't enough money in it.
All right, so I have a question and I will actually give it to Pratap. You can respond to Liz and also perhaps answer this question. It is from Richard Hoy, who says, I have lived in missing middle housing within a few blocks of downtown Bethesda since the 80s. How do we plan for this housing next to urban centers, hospitals, and campuses like the NIH?
That's a great question. Well, I'll start off with just piggybacking off of what Councilmember Riemer and Liz said. You know, you need And I can't emphasize this enough. You need as many diverse options of housing as possible. And there was a recent Council of Governments study that basically said in the next 10 years, we need about 75,000 more units. And this is for the entire DC area. That's a lot of units. We're not producing nearly as many in Montgomery County. In fact, we're typically producing a few thousand. And we also know about 72% of those new housing needs to be near transit. So this is something we always need to think about. DC area is a very desirable area for a variety of reasons. We all know it because we're here. We have reaped the benefits of being here. The government and its, private contracting, the universities, think tanks, you name it, it's here. And so as the region grows and there's additional stress on transportation and infrastructure, we know that there are certain places we have to grow. But to answer the question that was posed about NIH and missing middle housing, that's the beauty of missing middle, is that you can really do granular development where you're customizing the zoning, the height, the lot coverage, the setbacks, not only based on the community where it will reside, but also its functionality. How will it be potentially used? What is the purpose of the housing? What kind of criteria is it kind of achieving? What is the purpose of it? And so for a place like Bethesda, let's say in NIH, you have a lot of scientists, research physicians, interns. There may be a market for having temporary housing for people who are doing a fellowship, for instance. And that could be different in Silver Spring. We have a large arts community here. We have also government workers. We have a wide variety of people that could use missing middle. I hear from the medical professions that are working very hard right now during this COVID-19 crisis who don't have affordable housing options. And so the beauty of missing middle as we perceive it in the planning department is that by listening to you, the community, where it could potentially reside, and then also listening to the broader collective county and hearing from our constituents who are saying, I need more affordable options near business areas, near transit, we're able to customize zoning to achieve these important goals. And so one of the things we're trying to do in the Silver Spring plan is expanding the boundary study. And I want to emphasize the boundary study. This is currently in a study phase where we will look at options, and then based on those options and from community input, we will provide recommendations that the county council will ultimately approve. So to answer the question once again, having that granular level of analysis in missing middle zoning does allow you to have a dynamic zoning process that can tackle some of the missing middle issues.
Could I just add to that, please, that, the Silver Spring master plan that we're tackling is Silver Spring. The question of how it could be allowed in other parts of the county is going to have to be a separate conversation. So, the natural way to do it would be through a zoning text amendment. It is also a topic of the general plan. However, the general plan does not change zoning. The general plan is a policy document, expresses what the policy vision of the county is, but it does not actually change zoning. So in order to actually make it possible, to Richard's question, you would have to allow it to be, you'd have to allow it in the zoning code. So, we are looking at a zoning text amendment that would be available in certain locations around the county. That'll be a big topic, no question. We'll have, we'll need to really think our way through that.
Earlier this evening, Mike English posted a question on the chat asking, would the missing middle proposals also allow small to mid-sized apartment and condo buildings? Or would it be limited to townhouses and duplexes, triplexes? I think the immediate answer to that is yes. It can include really anything in that missing middle category. If you remember that diagram I showed at the very beginning, that includes courtyard townhouses, complexes, and small garden apartment buildings. But this leads me to ask the panel a question that is a little bit wonky. Being an architect, I'm a zoning wonk. The zoning regulations is the first thing I turn to when I start a new project, because it's going to control everything we can do on the site, from the front yard setbacks, side yard setbacks, rear yard setbacks, lot occupancy, building height. So there, in a single family residential zone, there are a lot of controls on how large that home can be in that community. And the zoning is particularly drafted for the community that property is in. To the panel, if this goes forward, do you imagine sort of form-based zoning applying to missing middle? Does it, for instance, could a large missing middle project be built on a road such as Piney Branch versus a road 2 blocks into a single family neighborhood? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll start. I don't know yet. I mean, I think that it's natural to say, let's allow it on larger streets, like on properties that are fronting larger streets, or, very adjacent to larger streets, where, you're likely to have bus routes, for example, where actually, one of the things I think we all see as we drive up our major corridors, Colesville or University or Beers Mill, you have a lot of aging housing that really wasn't built to withstand the intensity of use that is there from all of the vehicles. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of air pollution and things like that. So, it has always seemed to me that allowing for, those homes to be converted, redeveloped, maybe facing in the other direction, it would be, wouldn't it make sense to have a strip of townhomes where the front yard of that house is facing the other direction from the major arterial, where the residents there might have a shot at having kind of a quieter place to spend some time. Plus the structure itself could be built to withstand its setting a little better. But I don't know that we know yet. So your question is a good one. Where should it be allowed? And there's lots of different options, and I don't know that we really know yet.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is that it will be a public discussion. I mean, it will be, if this goes to the next step, there will be hearings, multiple hearings about what's the appropriate way to approach this. And I think that's important to point out.
Absolutely. And I think where you can build a tear-down single-family home, why wouldn't we want you to also be able to build a duplex or a triplex? And to your point about form-based code, if you could ensure that the size of that structure isn't going to be, significantly different, no matter how many units you put in there, I think people might be more comfortable with that. So.
I think that's true, but what I'm realizing is I listen to the community is, and realizing that I saw it the same way. We kind of want to structure this the way it is now. Like, we understand setbacks, and we understand front setbacks are different than side setbacks, and we want to have some comfort level that will be the same. And so, for instance, on the 26-page Montgomery County, which actually is a wonderful report done in 2018 on missing middle housing, it's the staff says, I don't know if we're going to have setbacks. I'm not sure what the lot coverage is going to be. And that is, as you're thinking about a larger piece of property, and maybe in a bungalow court, say, there is more, the common property is in the middle. So it's just built differently. But if you think about the simplest, what you were saying, Hans, the simplest example of it, which is builder's going to take down this 1942 one level rancher. And I don't know, we don't even use the word rancher. I don't know why I just said that, rambler. And they're going to put up a new house. You can either allow that builder to put up a $1.5 million house or a triplex. That triplex is not going to be affordable housing. It is going to be significantly more affordable than what would be put there otherwise. Something is going to go there. And that's what we I feel like what we have to kind of wrap our brains around. We already give the developer the permission to put up the mass that they are going to put up. So the question is, are we going to give them permission to allow more families to either rent or have the possibility of home ownership on what a lot of times is going to be that same mass?
That's a great point, Liz. And just so you know, we do have an existing zoning called CRN that does allow for some sort of missing middle. And to Hans's point, a ZTA is required to really create probably a more dynamic kind of zoning element. But we have used, and we are planning on using the CRN before. We used it in the Beers Mill corridor. We're currently doing the only downtown center master plan, sector plan. We're implementing CRN zoning there. CRN zoning, as it stands, does have setback height requirements. It also does require stormwater management. You would have to do a site plan. You would have to go through DPS. So, there are going to be parameters to whatever comes out of this plan for missing middle. I don't envision a scenario where you're going to have kind of like what I think people are often afraid of when you see in Washington, D.C. Like, I think we've all seen the pop-up houses where you see a row home and there's like a 5-story house in the middle of the two. And you're like, how did that happen? Well, it happened because there was a loophole in the zoning that didn't have a height restriction. And, they were able to get the structure created in a way that was sound, and they wanted to maximize their footprint. I don't see that happening in Silver Spring, and that's why I think it's important to have this discussion now, and we're going to have multiple discussions with the community, but I just want to put that out there for now.
Thank you so much. Do we have any comments from Councilmember Riemer at this time? I just want to make sure I do a check-in.
Well, I'd love to talk about my farm solar ZTA, but we should do that another time.
Yes, I would say so. That would be a whole different conversation.
Thank you for the discussion tonight.
No, you're most welcome. I also want to just quickly recognize Josh Tulkin. He's the director of Sierra Club Maryland, and he's on the call. Josh, do you want to introduce yourself and say something?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Tulkin, the director of the Maryland chapter and also a Montgomery County resident. I'm just thrilled that the Montgomery County group and all of you have joined into this conversation wholeheartedly. I've been learning. There's so much to learn, but the more I learn, the more I understand the interconnection between housing, zoning, justice, and ultimately the climate when transportation comes into play. And I'm very excited about exploring this issue as a community, how we can become more active on it, to understand. And I'm really, really excited about all of the different people who have come in to learn more and engage on this issue. So I just wanted to commend the Montgomery County group leadership and the members of the Montgomery County Council for their leadership and for participating and driving this conversation forward.
Thank you so much. All right, and I know we had one question about the historic districts, and I was wondering if one of our panelists have any insights into how missing middle could be made possible in historic districts.
That's all you, Bill.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Maybe I didn't introduce this in my introduction, but I sat on the Historic Preservation Commission for 10 years, 6 years as its chair. So I can't say we saw much of this. One of the examples you saw tonight, I'm not going to name the address, but one of the examples you saw tonight was a new property owner who has since subdivided the property after he got approvals for us to renovate the house, and he subdivided it into a triplex. I think it's very appropriate in historic districts. I think, you know, one of the most important things in historic preservation is adaptive reuse. You know, buildings have to be kept alive. They have to be kept useful. You know, historic preservation, it gets a bad rap for this, but it's not about preserving things in time for perpetuity. It's about allowing change and allowing adaptation. And this fits right in with historic preservation guidelines. You know, allowing missing middle housing in historic districts makes them more vital. You know, it introduces that additional type of housing that's desperately needed, and I think is a very appropriate way of renovating structures in historic districts.
Thank you for that, Bill. And I want to mention something that Mike English has shared. He said, other than attending events like this, county planning meetings, including submitting testimony and general word of mouth, what can we do to push for more supply in Montgomery County?
Yeah, just the end of that was, I'm worried that with the pandemic, like there's a lot of assumption that there'll be less demand in the future in urban areas and whatnot. And the data doesn't really bear that out. Like it's not what most people are predicting who are like in the know on it, but it's definitely a perception out there just talking with people. It's my concern that there'll be some pushback against plans to expand supply just because of the moment of time we're in. So if there's anything else we can do to kind of keep the pressure up to keep the supply going or to keep it increasing.
Great point. You know, I think the world is upside down at the moment, and you know, hopefully it will get right side up again next year. And you know, meanwhile, we do have some very significant housing proposals on the table, and I think we have been making progress educating, you know, the community that housing is a climate issue. And I think it's one of the more powerful ways to talk about housing, that, you know, having housing close to public transportation where people can drive less, you know, that the emissions from our vehicles is one of the largest sources of climate pollution. And so if we're going to actually tackle the climate you know, emergency and have solutions, we've got to have housing where people can drive less. And I think more and more people are understanding that, although, you know, people are challenged to drive less, you know, themselves. It's difficult, right? But I think everybody's hopefully getting comfortable with the idea that even if you drive, you know, you're not going to change your commute. You understand that someone else might be willing to live over public transportation in a high rise near the metro and walk and bike. And that's good for you. You know, that helps you. That means less pollution that you breathe in and a brighter future for your children and grandchildren. So, you know, I think the Sierra Club has a huge role to play helping create this consensus that housing is an absolutely essential part of our climate strategy. And if we don't have an aggressive plan to support the construction of housing, you know, where people can drive less, then we're just, you know, it is one of the most critical levers that we have to pull at the local level. And so we've got to keep our eyes on that ball and keep pushing harder and harder. And, you know, the decisions that we make at the county today, the council today are not even the same decisions we would have made 2 or 3 years ago. You know, that's how fast things are evolving. Like, I think if we had to do the downtown Bethesda master plan again, I think we would just rezone the Saks neighborhood. You know, we wouldn't have asked whether it was okay to have a, you know, a floating zone over the Saks neighborhood. We just would have rezoned it, you know? So we're making progress. I think all of us working together and you know, pushing forward is having an impact. And, you know, let's keep at it.
Thank you so much. We have 8 minutes. I want to take a question from Elizabeth, and then actually want to give a shout out to Dave Sears, who's the former chair of the group and also currently the land use chair. So question from Elizabeth: can zoning ensure environmental protection of green canopy during construction? Silver Spring has lost so much to PL construction, and climate change will require more urban forests. I think that's a comment. Oh, there's a question on
I'll
zoning.
briefly comment, maybe Bill. But I mean, building codes and zoning have a huge influence on the requirements for green roofs, for efficiency of buildings, for conservation of forests. That's less of an issue, of course, in an urban center. Not really an issue in an urban center, but to grow the canopy in downtown Silver Spring, I think we really need to be talking about street tree plantings, green roofs, maybe somewhere in the urban area finding a park location. But the green strategy for downtown Silver Spring is high rises. That is the greenest thing that we can do, because it means every 100 people living in a high rise in downtown Silver Spring, or 100 people not living somewhere farther away where they're driving, or maybe converting a farm to a housing development. So, we do need to kind of keep that perspective. But redevelopment is an essential part of the environmental strategy, because old buildings leak air, they leak energy, and they don't have stormwater control. So when you replace an old building with a new building, you're always going to be creating more energy efficiency and better stormwater protections, as well as providing housing in a place where people can live closer to public transportation and drive less. So there's a lot of environmental benefits that come, and those are important to kind of factor into the equation.
And just to quickly make a point, Montgomery County's green canopy is actually getting better. So if you look at the satellite images from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and today, we're actually getting greener and greener. And so I think sometimes there's this misconception, because we had to tear, there's some trees were removed for the purple line, and obviously some trees have to be removed because trees, like anything else, don't last forever. But generally speaking, the county has been getting greener. We have a tree fund that you're required to put in. I know, because I had to write a check when I was developing my land, even though I saved many of my trees. That goes into a fund that allows people to have shade trees that is used all over the county. And to council members' point, you should also understand, as part of our sustainability model, the more people we get out of cars, the less stormwater runoff we have. There's a direct nexus between what's happening with our lifestyles, our driving our cars. If you ever look at 495 and kind of the catch basin areas of Sligo Creek, you can actually see where the pollutants coming from impervious surfaces trickle down into Mother Nature. And, the Parks Department has done an incredible job of trying to filter that so it doesn't destroy our very fragile environment. But creating a more urban Montgomery County, where we're growing where we're supposed to grow, prevents us from having to develop in sprawling locations like we've done in the past. And obviously the Ag Reserve was part of that theory as well.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Pratap, because we just got a question from Sylvia Tonetti, who's our water lead, said, how can we ensure that we are also reining in sprawl development and protecting rural areas?
Right. Well, we have to continue to support the zoning strategy that we have in this county, which is a smart growth strategy. But I also think we have to do something that supports a stronger housing market to actually create the housing that we need. One of the problems that we have is that we have restricted housing where we don't want it, generally speaking, and we've said we don't want it. We've allowed it where we do want it, but we're not getting it where we want it. There's not a lot of housing construction where we really want it. And I think we have to figure out why. Why is it that the market has such demand, but the supply isn't meeting the demand? Why are you seeing weak construction numbers? We have generally about 2,000 to 2,500 units of housing that are added to our supply every year, but we believe we need 5,000 to 6,000 every year, and that gap creates a long-term affordability crisis. And what it does is it means that people end up having to drive to other places. That means you live in Frederick, you know, where the housing is maybe a little bit more affordable because the market is a little bit stronger there, creating new housing. So we have to kind of put our money where our mouth is, or our policy where our mouth is, and figure out how to change the market dynamics so that the housing market will actually produce the housing where we want it. I don't know if it's the taxes or the regulations or the, you know, other issues, but that's part of what the legislation I'm proposing around the metro is about, is that if we can't get high rises on top of our metro stations, you know, we've got a problem. And we don't have any. Like, we have literally none. And there's a developer that wants to build them in Grosvenor and that can't, you know, the market's not working. So, you know, until we solve those kinds of problems, there's going to be more and more pressure for the more exurban housing. You know, and that's not what we want. We don't want exurban housing. We want urban housing.
Thank you so much. And one of the questions from Erin is actually quite an important one related to what we are talking. She's asking, what ensures that these new duplexes or missing middle housing is actually affordable? There are a ton of these in DC, but they are outrageously priced. And I know, Liz, you had mentioned something on the pricing, so I'm going to give it to you.
Yes.
Onto this.
So nothing guarantees. That doesn't mean that there can't be some affordable housing, but if you take again the simplest example, that this house is going to be taken down, is it going to be a $1.5 million house, or is it going to be a triplex? Those triplexes are going to be, you know, between $500,000 and $600,000. They're not, you cannot have a truly affordable housing situation without a government program that backs that. The money has to come from somewhere. And so you can't, so there has to be a big enough piece of property where the developer is motivated to, has enough profit in order to work in those MPDUs or those affordable units. But if you're talking about and that's why a lot of people, there's a lot of confusion around missing middle. And that is because people want to read or understand the middle as less expensive. And it frankly isn't going to be less expensive, because you're talking about very small projects. And the developer is not going to, there's not enough profit in order to have these. What you can say is they're going to provide more housing, and they're going to be less than what would be there otherwise. And that's really the honesty. That's really the answer as far as I can see. You cannot have truly affordable housing without a program that someone is going to provide that additional money.
Thank you. I'll make a last comment. We're at 8:32, but this is from Cheryl Gannon. The communication with affected neighborhoods could have been much better. The Woodside Civic Association had 3 days notice of what was in this proposal and not enough time to talk it through with the residents. I think serious thought should be given to working towards buy-in, and this was a mistake to leave the neighborhood out. I'm not sure if this is particularly directed to.
I'd like to, if I could.
Sure.
You know, what we have started, what Pratap and team at the planning board have started, is the conversation over whether to do this. So now we will have about, I don't know, a year for public engagement and dialogue. Admittedly, it was a late decision to say whether or not we will talk about doing this. But the way we do our planning, we draw a map, we draw a boundary, and we say we're going to study everything inside this boundary, and we're not going to rezone anything that's outside of this boundary. And that's fair notice to the community that if you are not inside that boundary, you don't have to worry that anything is going to change for you. Well, in this conversation, it was a late decision to proceed with the idea of considering whether to do missing middle. And in order to do that, we had to draw a larger boundary so that everybody in there would have due notice. So ironically, we were actually trying to provide notice so that the community would then have the opportunity to spend the next year in a transparent public discussion about what is the ideal, way to proceed. Some people thought that the actual decision was to change the zoning, was to do this. And that's all we're doing is saying, now we're going to talk about it. So hopefully that will, as people learn that that's the real circumstance, that will create some comfort.
And I'll be quick, Shruti, just to piggyback on that, during one of the planning board sessions, I identified that the traditional CBD for Silver Spring didn't make sense in terms of the Purple Line stations and the priorities the county council has put on affordable housing and the housing resolution, and of course our climate crisis. And so what we're doing is expanding the boundary so we can study it. We're going to have a tremendous amount of public engagement where you could provide your feedback. We're doing it even within the planning board sessions. We've had an unprecedented amount of participation, which is an indication that people are following this very closely. And so I want to stress that no decisions have been made. This is the beginning of the process. And even after we provide our input, it's going to go to the county council, and then they're going to have hearings too. And so there is a duplicative process in our bureaucracy to ensure that there are different ways of participating. And so I want to make it clear that not only is this a long journey ahead, but there's different layers to it. And we really hope that you'll participate all throughout the process.
Thank you, Pratap. And as we wrap up, actually, I will take two more comments. I hope you don't mind just staying a couple of minutes. I know this is important to people. So there's one question from Louis, and then we have Richard, and then we will wrap up for the evening. So Louis says, transit-oriented communities, in quotes, around the metro in other areas are virtually surrounded by cars all over the street because people still need a car. What's the solution?
I think I can try and answer that. I think that we have the situation with making sure that transportation serves all our communities. It's kind of a separate issue from housing, but it is connected. And I definitely think that we need to start looking more at making sure that our buses and that our regional transit service serves more than just the 9-to-5 commuter, because honestly, that's how we see a lot of our bus routes built right now. Some of them only run during peak hours. Some of them aren't running at all during COVID. And that is incredibly problematic, and a lot of that has to do with budget constraints, unfortunately. But the conversation about how we can pivot our transit system to serve all communities so we can start weaning off of our dependence on cars is definitely important. And people also start weaning their dependence off cars, obviously, if they live closer to transit hubs, if they live closer to work, which is what this whole housing discussion is about, right? We want to make sure that we emphasize more walkable communities and ways of traveling that don't necessarily mean that you have to get into a car.
Thank you, Zoe. Would anybody else want to piggyback on that?
I'll be real quick. One of the things when we study how people are actually using their cars, a lot of it is these really small trips where you're trying to get a gallon of milk or you're trying to run a quick errand. And so one of our visions for the general plan is how can we create more amenities within your neighborhood so you're not having to get into a vehicle. And so right now, Montgomery County, was built on the backbone of vehicle traffic. And now we're trying to move to a multimodal element that incorporates a lot of different kinds of transportation options. So it's going to take time to get there. Having a state highway administration that governs a lot of our main arteries doesn't help. But we are trying to get them to even move into a certain direction. I think we're all hopeful, especially given the fact that they've now closed some streets off to pedestrians. And so it's going to be a process. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're definitely moving in the right direction.
The last one is from Richard, and he says, the deli within a 5-minute walk of my house in Bethesda has restricted hours due to the staff relying on public transit to Germantown. Can we quantify some of this lost potential? And before we respond to that, Richard, can you unmute yourself if there was anything I missed on this question you had?
I'm particularly concerned about the interplay of land use and transportation. And I'm car free, and I've been so for 25 years. I'm retired from the fire department in Montgomery County, and I live in Bethesda, in a neighborhood I shouldn't be able to live in because I live in missing middle housing my entire life, and even now in retirement. So I'm particularly concerned about the interplay of transportation and land use, and the concept of a 15-minute neighborhood. I think that we need to speak and describe the policy changes we're about in aspirational terms that give the voter a picture and an investment in the changes in policies. Now, we approach policies as a reductionist approach, not a creative approach. So we're trying not to unset the apple cart in all the other policies that we've made. And I think that hamstrings us. So maybe we could talk about the 15-minute, the concept of getting everything you need within a walkable distance that you might need to drive to occasionally, but less.
That's right, Richard. I think, life within walking distance, I think that is an ideal. And I think a lot of us would probably regret the planning model that required people to get in the car and drive to the store. I think that is very difficult to maintain. So we're having to work our way out of that. But I think you're absolutely correct, and that is certainly the vision that many of us have.
Thank you so much to everybody. I just put in the chat, thank you, Council Member Riemer, and to our Planning Board Member Pratap Verma, to our panelists, and to everyone who joined us. We really value your participation. These are really, really important issues, and it takes all of us to advocate for them and to learn more about them and to share our thoughts with our elected representatives and decision makers for us to move forward in the right direction. And as we heard several times today from many people, there is no one solution to these issues. So we did our best to take all the questions that we could, and we will be happy to share contact information in a thank you note as a follow-up to everyone who registered. But thanks again for taking the time to join us today, and we hope you will stay engaged and join our other meetings as well. Have a good evening, everyone.